Yes, Scottish Ballet is one of Scotland's national performing companies, one of five, together with Scottish Opera, the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, Scottish Chamber Orchestra and National Theatre of Scotland. And in April 2007, the five national performing companies were brought into a direct funding relationship with the Scottish Government. And that aligned us effectively with the national collections, so that we were seen not only on that level, but also delivering for Scotland at a national level. And what that means is continuing to service a broad range of communities across Scotland with producing high quality work, in our case ballet, producing new work and touring that across the country. But also, quite crucially, being an ambassador for Scotland elsewhere in the UK and abroad. And this was quite an important statement in coming into direct funding relationship, that we really were there to represent Scotland in that wider field. Another key part of that is about achieving and maintaining a status as an international company. And that doesn't necessarily mean continual international touring. We do some of that, of course, but what it also means, quite crucially, is producing work that can be compared and performs well at an international level, and that we're also seen regularly at places, well, events like Edinburgh International Festival, and at locations and venues that are considered to be setting the benchmark for international performance, such as Sadler's Wells in London. So in making that move to a direct funding relationship with the government, the national status of our company and those others was really established in a much firmer sense than it had previously been through formal funding structures. And I think that's one of the challenges of being a national company in Scotland, because we have such a diverse geographical climate as well as a demographic one. And for us to properly service Scotland as a nation, we need to perform not only at the large scale level, but we also need to service communities through smaller scale touring. So we recently, in the past few months, we did a large scale tour across Scotland to the main urban centres, and then immediately on the heels of that did a small scale tour, and that stretched from the Western Isles and Orkneys down to Stranraer and Dumfries and Galloway and into the borders and everywhere in between. So there's that sense of being able to get to a wide range of communities. That's a challenge that no other ballet company in the UK has to face, because they're not serving the same or servicing the same breadth of communities. For us to be able to do that means we have to create two programmes in the same season, so that requires even further rehearsal time and production resource to do. We also are touring internationally. We were in China last year, and we're planning a tour to the US next year, next autumn. But in neither of those years could we also undertake a small scale tour, because we effectively need to find the time within our production and touring schedule to create an entirely new programme of work to do that. So in order to fulfil that very wide remit of servicing Scotland's communities, small and large, through to international touring, we can't do it all in the space of 1 year. So when we're doing our planning, it really falls into a 2 or 3 year planning cycle, so that we try over a period of time to be able to achieve all of those goals and be sure that we're meeting the aspirations of our key stakeholder, the Scottish Government, but more importantly, producing the best possible work we could. The net cost of touring to smaller communities is higher, because we can't be doing 7 shows in a week in a 1,500-seater auditorium. We might have an auditorium seating 100 people, 150. You get a much higher proportion of the local community turning out than you might do in the cities, but the fact is you'll never be able to generate the revenue to offset the costs of going there. Yeah, so it is. It's about 70% of our turnover is government grant and aid, and the next highest proportion is through box office income. So it's critical, and when we face variations in the economic climate that might temper an individual's desire to go out and spend money on going to the theatre, then we're very much affected by that. So box office is the next largest, but also one of the more risky elements of our income. We also rely on support and donations from individuals, from trusts and foundations, and also partnerships with business sponsors. And again, that makes up a fairly substantial proportion of that additional income that we generate. And then a certain amount will come through either smaller partnership grants, merchandising, advertising and programme brochures. But the key one, about 20% of our turnover comes through box office, 6 or 7% through fundraising and sponsorship, and the rest through a variety of more minor sources.
There's been a bit of a climate change towards the whole question of philanthropy in relation to the arts, hasn't there, in the past half year or so, and I just wonder whether you think that might be a growing element in terms of supporting the company's activities.
Yes, well, we certainly are seeing that individual giving is the major growth area, and whether that's an individual who simply becomes a friend of Scottish Ballet for £50 a year, or someone who at the other end of the spectrum might set up a charitable trust as a vehicle for their individual giving. So we attract support from the full range there. What's interesting is that the coalition government of Westminster were very bullish early on in their tenure about the fact that there was a need for, to do with the big society idea, for people to be supporting good causes more directly than previously. Although I think there's a great unreality in the fact that the scale of government cuts to the culture sector could ever be filled through philanthropic advances. There just isn't the scale of income within the UK or available to access internationally to fill that gap. Yeah. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the next few years plan out. But individual giving for us and for other companies we know is increasing, but it won't increase to the scale to fill the public funded cuts we're facing. I think that the analogy with music is a good one with a composer, because effectively a composer is able to write down, to score his composition. So there's written material there that one can refer to. It's very clear. With choreography, even though there are systems of dance notation and they are used to some extent, by and large, and increasingly so, work is created in the studio. It's learned directly by the dancers. They put it on their bodies, they have it in their heads. It's very rarely written down. We use video increasingly every day in the studio as you're creating or rehearsing. You've got the video running, and we have a whole archive of rehearsal footage as something is being developed, changed, and eventually archive recordings of performances, so that there's a way of preserving it to be able to revive the work in future. But it's not there in such a format that could be compared one to the other as you might compare a score if someone were to challenge that and to say you've appropriated my composition.
Would dancers use video to actually look at their moves, or is it much more for the archiving of the process of constructing the dance, as it were?
They'll only refer to video to learn material. Otherwise, it's entirely learned live in the studio and digested and retained that way. So when we're reviving a production, as we have done for this winter season, if there are dancers who want to remind themselves of roles they've done before, they'll look at the archive performance recording. Or if they're going to be doing a new role, then they'll look at that and refresh themselves before they go into the studio. But then when the rehearsals begin, it's all again being taught live. The ballet staff or rehearsal directors may refresh themselves by returning to the video, but the actual way of reviving and therefore restaging work is done live, face-to-face, person-to-person, and not essentially using any other media. It's there for education and promotional purposes, and when we're working with choreographers and indeed with designers or composers occasionally, whoever might be creating material for a new piece, we get their permission in terms of how we structure contracts to allow educational and promotional use. And promotional really is non-commercial, so it's not there and wouldn't be available without incurring additional fees to exploit it in any other way. But for educational, either re-educating and relearning ourselves, or indeed for promoting the work through our education programs. In terms of choreographic rights, whenever we're either engaging a choreographer to make something new, or we're licensing their choreography for the company, it's a fairly straightforward contractual process. What's interesting is the creative partners, collaborators beyond that. The choreographers' rights and their IP is pretty well established and preserved in that way. Designers also of costume and set and props, so it's quite well established that they will have created something which then they receive a fee for, and you'll license it for a period of time. Beyond that, it gets quite interesting. I'll park music because music is quite well established, but we're working with a director on a future project, and it's interesting because this particular director, she will be the lead person in the creative team in terms of conceiving of the work and structuring it, getting the scenarios there, and she will direct it, and she'll receive a fee for that. But once she's done her job as a director, she's done. She doesn't, it's interesting, she won't see that as, you can't revive that without my permission, because it's there and she's done a job in that way. And it's quite interesting because the theatre director coming in to work with a ballet company is unusual, and therefore that's kind of pushing the boundaries of where you would expect IP rights issues to settle down. So that's interesting. We've also worked in the past with a dramaturg, and the dramaturg worked in partnership with the choreographer. The choreographer was the lead person within the team, but the dramaturg was there to help identify, draw out and structure the narrative. So again, he came in, a fee for services, that's it done, and we can continue to revive that work in future without any issues to do with his contribution to the process. And then when we work with lighting designers, there is a move within the lighting design world to try to establish their rights and licensing on the same level as designers of set and costume and so on. It's not there yet, and they're brought in quite late in the process usually to produce the lighting for a set fee, and once it's there existing, we can have the ability in perpetuity to revive that work without any need to relicense. Crediting, of course, for all of those is essential into the future, but in terms of seeking fees for further rights to use the work, it falls away after the choreographer and composer.